Hello, everybody, and welcome to part 2 of my War of the Spark set review. Today we are going to be talking about the blue cards of War of the Spark, going through each card, starting with the commons, then moving to the uncommons, and finishing with the mythics and rares. But before I begin, I do want to remind you that if you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that thumbs up button. If this video gets to 50 thumbs up, 50, I guarantee that I will be making a future installment of my War of the Spark set review, so be sure to hit that thumbs up if you want to support the video. Also, if you want to vote on which color I do next, be sure to leave that in the comment section down below. Just say what color you want to see, and I will try to accommodate as many people as I can. Also, if you have any questions about the cards or anything I say in this set review, be sure to leave that in the comments section down below as well. I really do enjoy answering all of your questions and helping you get ready for the pre-release. And finally, if you do want to join me on this journey, if you want to catch future installments of the set review, be sure to hit that subscribe button. Also, if you want to catch my draft videos, be sure to hit subscribe. And if you just basically want to join the team, hit that subscribe button. It really does help me out a ton, and I appreciate each and every one of you. Before I dive in, I do want to mention that I am going to be using Scryfall for this review, which is just a very useful website that helps you sort by cards. So I recommend you use Scryfall yourself, and there will be a link to it in the description down below. And yeah, let's get into it. First of all, we're going to mention my grading scale. I don't really believe in grading scales, but people generally like to have indicators of how strong cards are. Draft is such a contextual format that generally you want to be evaluating cards based on your deck rather than just following a pick order list. So keep that in mind when I'm giving a card a number. It's way more important what I say about the card than the number that I give it. That being said, my scale is very simple. 5 cards that are 5s are incredible. 4s are incredible. They're just the bombs. The best cards are the best. 4s are strong cards that actively draw you into their colors. If you have a couple 4s, you're probably going to want to play that color. 3s are average cards. They're just like everyday run-of-the-mill cards. They're generally like cards that you're like, okay, I have to put that in my deck. It's fine. 2s are below average cards. You end up running several number of 2s in your deck, but generally you're not as happy to have them. Those are like the vanilla creatures and things like that. And then 1 cards are unplayable, very, very bad cards. But yes, let's get into the blue cards. I'll just pull up my top 5 blue commons, and I'll mention those when I get to them. So number 1, we have Ashiok's Skulker. Ashiok's Skulker is just going to be a solid 3, sometimes a 2.5, but basically 5 mana 3/5 is a solid enough body, and then the ability to become unblockable is just extra gravy, especially in a format with planeswalkers that you're going to want to be able to kill. So I think Ashiok's Skulker is just going to be a 3. A very solid playable, but not a card you want too many copies of because 5-drops are pretty expendable. But it is definitely a good card. Next up, we have Aven Eternal. I have Aven Eternal at a 3.5. I have it as actually the number 2 blue common, and it could actually be the number 1 blue common. This card is incredible. 3 mana 2/2 flyer is already good, and it enters the battlefield. When it enters the battlefield, you amass 1. Now, amass is a tricky mechanic to analyze because it does depend a lot on how many amass things your deck has. If this is your only amass card, a 3 mana 2/2 flyer plus a 1/1 ground creature is really good. However, a 3 mana 2/2 that puts a +1/+1 counter on one of your creatures is also very good. So Aven Eternal is going to be a very good card no matter what. I have it at a 3.5. You're going to want to take these fairly early. They work well in multiples because you're going to be growing that amass creature, or you can be chumping with your amass creature and then making new army tokens. So Aven Eternal is definitely going to be a good card. Next up, we have Callous Dismissal. Now this card, I was initially very high on it, and then I realized that it is a sorcery. This card goes way down in my pick order because of it being a sorcery, because bounce spells... Oh, sorry, I haven't been zooming in. This is Ashiok's Skulker for all of you folks. This is Aven Eternal. And this is Callous Dismissal. Sorry about that. Callous Dismissal, being sorcery speed, really goes down a ton in value because a lot of the time you're going to be getting value out of bounce spells is during combat when your opponent goes for a combat trick. And the fact that Callous Dismissal is at sorcery speed means that you lose a lot of that value. The fact that it does amass 1 means that it is a little bit better than it normally would be. And the fact that it can bounce army tokens that are potentially large also means it gains some value. So especially out of the sideboard, if your opponent has a lot of amass cards, Callous Dismissal does gain a lot of value. But in the main deck, this card is very, very narrow. I actually think it's a 2 in the main deck because if you're just bouncing an online permanent at sorcery speed and putting a counter onto your army token, that's just not a very good card. If it was just a 2 mana 1/1 that bounced a creature, it would probably be okay, but the fact that you'll a lot of the time have an army token already, just putting a counter on your creature and bouncing an opposing creature at sorcerer speed is not a very good card. So I think you'll begrudgingly play it, but it's not going to be a very solid card, so I have it at a 4. Next up, we have Contentious Plan. Now this card is going to be it's very tricky to analyze because it's hard to say how many +1/+1 counters are going to be running around before the format starts. That being said, I think Contentious Plan, for me at least, is going to start out at a 2. You're not really going to want to play this type of card, but if you have enough +1/+1 counters, you're going to end up playing it some amount of the time. If you don't have any +1/+1 counters synergies, it's a 1, it's unplayable. And then it generally moves up from there. I think most decks in this format are going to generally have some way to use the proliferate. They're going to have a couple cards that can get +1/+1 counters. So if this card says put 2 +1/+1 counters on your creatures, draw a card, that's actually a good card. But I think that a lot of the time it's going to be put 1 +1/+1 counter or not even put any counters. A lot of the time you're going to maybe have a Planeswalker too, and you can maybe squeeze an extra activation out of it because of Contentious Plan, so that'd be good as well. But I'm going to start out very low on Contentious Plan. It's going to be a 2, maybe a 1.5, somewhere in that low range. Next up, we have Crush Dissent. I'm not very high on this card. 4 mana counterspells are generally not going to be good enough in Limited. You can't afford to hold up 4 mana because that generally means you're skipping your 4 mana play, which means that oftentimes you'll be behind your opponent, and if your opponent just does nothing on their turn, or they hold up an instant of their own, you just lose the game. The fact that you do get to amass 2 means that this card gains a little bit of value, but the fact is you can't just cast this on their end step to make a 2/2. You have to use it to directly counter a spell. Which means that Crush Dissent is really not going to be an effective card. I have this at a 1. Maybe there will be some decks that want to play it, but I really think it's unplayable in almost every single case. You just can't afford to hold up 4 mana at instant speed, 4 mana for a counter that's not even an unconditional counter. Their opponent can still, in the late game or even in the mid game, just play a spell and not have it be countered by Crush Dissent. So not really a huge fan of Crush Dissent. Definitely not a very good card. Next up, we have Erratic Visionary. I actually have this card as the number 4 blue common, which may be saying something about the quality of blue commons, because this card's not insane. 2 mana 1/3 is a fine body. And then the extra ability to loot in the late game, which is draw a card, discard a card, is nice. But that being said, it's still only a 3. It's a card that you're happy to play. The looting ability does give it extra utility in the late game. It means you're not going to draw too many lands, but Erratic Visionary is still nothing more than just a solid card. The looting ability is expensive, and it's also a card that's not as good in multiples because you can't really afford to pay that mana for that activation over and over and over. So Erratic Visionary, I have it as the number 4 blue common, but it's definitely not an insane card or anything like that. Next up, we have Casa Minha's Transmutation, which is a card I do think is quite good. I have it as the number 1 blue common. It is essentially a blue removal spell. Making the creature into a 1/1 will often kill it. That being said, keep in mind that if you do put it on an army creature, it just says its base power and toughness is 1/1, so it does keep all of the +1/+1 counters it had on it before, and I believe you can still amass onto it because it still is an army for the amass ability. So Casa Minha's Transmutation doesn't really deal with the army tokens, but it deals with everything else pretty effectively. It isn't the greatest against +1/+1 counter synergies either, so this card could definitely be a lot worse than this. That being said, whenever blue gets access to a removal spell, I'm very keen. Usually, keen, that's a fun word. I love that word. Jeez, keen. I'm very keen on it. Casa Minha's Transmutation is definitely a card that you should not be sleeping on, especially in Sealed, where your opponent is oftentimes going to have bombs. The fact that the creature loses all of its abilities is also quite relevant against a lot of the scariest creatures you could be dealing with. So I think Casa Minha's Transmutation is going to be good, but definitely not an insane bomb-level card, and I could definitely see taking Aven Eternal over it in many situations. But the first copy is definitely going to be good for a lot of blue decks. Next up, we have Kiora's Dambreaker. 6 mana for a 5/6 is not an insane rate. It could give you that top end that you need, and if you have enough +1/+1 counter synergies, the Proliferate ability could be relevant as well. I'm going to start with this card being a 2. Expensive cards are generally very replaceable, but you'll sometimes run this in your decks, and if you have enough Proliferate, I could definitely see bumping it up to a 2.5 even. It definitely really depends on how good Proliferate is, but a 6 mana 5/6 is just going to be a solid body in a lot of decks. Next up, we have Naga Eternal. 3 mana 3/2 is pretty much the definition of a 2.0. Just a card that you'll play sometimes. Actually, it's more of a 1.5. If you have to play a 3 mana 3/2, you're generally very unhappy, but it can slide into your decks. I'm not going to say it's unplayable. There was a card like this in Ravnica Allegiance, Coral Commando, I believe it was. Boom! I feel so proud that I remembered that name because I never played that card. But Naga Eternal is definitely a card that you're going to play sometimes. It does have some added benefits. There are a couple cards that give you benefits for having zombies, so keep that in mind. If you have a couple zombie payoffs, maybe Naga Eternal gets a little bit better, but generally Naga Eternal is going to be a 1.5, and maybe if you have a couple zombie payoffs that maybe give it flying, or give it death touch, or I think Menace is one of them, it could get a little bit better than that. Next up, we have No Escape. It's a 3 mana counterspell that can counter a creature or planeswalker, and then you scry one. So generally, you're going to be using this to counter a creature. There's not going to be all that many planeswalkers running around, even though there is one in each pack. Keep in mind that a lot of the planeswalkers are unplayable in Limited, or they're just, you're not going to necessarily just get 2 on-color planeswalkers. So a lot of the time, your opponent's deck will have 1, maybe 2 planeswalkers in it. So No Escape being able to counter those is nice because it stops them and means you don't have to kill them. Overall, I think No Escape is going to be a 2.5. It's slightly below the I'm very happy to play this card, but it's definitely above the I'll play this card. I think you would generally only want to have like 1 copy of this card because they do get a lot worse in multiples. If you draw a couple of these and you have fallen behind on board, it's not great. but generally you'll be able to counter something that costs about as much as No Escape, or maybe a little bit more. It's definitely no Essence Scatter, but it is a card that I think will be playable, especially considering that blue does not seem to have the greatest commons in this set. So No Escape, definitely going to be, it's also good to keep in mind that this card is much better in sealed. Your opponent's going to be playing a slower game plan. They're going to have a lot more expensive cards. And also just this set looks a little bit slower than other sets that we've had recently. So if this set ends up being slow, No Escape also gains a lot of value because holding up the mana is very easy to do in later game situations. And also you're not going to be as punished for falling behind on the board early. Next up, we have Relentless Advance, and this card is a 1, I think. 4 mana for a 3/3 is already not good, and if you were playing this and just putting 3 counters on a creature, 4 mana to put 3 counters on a creature at sorcery speed is also not good. So Relentless Advance, definitely going to get a 1 from me. I think this card's very unplayable, very bad, and you should not be playing it in your deck. I think, yeah, generally just quite a poor card. And I don't think it's going to be perform very well. If it was an instant, it might have some merit because you could use it as a combat trick or make a flash blocker, but I just think Relentless Advance is not going to be great. Generally, when I'm thinking about amass cards, I don't really think that... I'm just thinking... Not really picturing the army token just carrying the game all by itself. Maybe there's some decks that just only play amass cards, and then Relentless Advance has a home. But I just generally I'm gonna steer clear of this to start with and wait until I start losing to that type of card before I just assume it's good. Next up we have Sky Theater Strix. It's a 2 mana 1/2 flyer, so that's generally just not big enough. It doesn't trade with a 2 mana 2/2 a lot of the time, and then whenever you cast a non-creature spell, it gets buffed. Important to keep it in mind that there isn't like a ton of instants running around in blue. This doesn't need to be instants, but a lot of the time it'll be better if you can use it mid-combat to maybe surprise the opponent in trade or something like that. But there are a couple instants and sorceries. I think this card's just a 2, maybe a 1.5 even. It's not a very good card, but you'll sometimes have to play it. And in certain decks where you have a lot of instants and sorceries, it might be like a 2 mana 2/2 flyer enough that it's good enough in certain situations. But generally, I just don't think it's a very powerful card, and it's better relegated to the sidelines. Next up, we have Spellkeeper Weird. This card reminds me of Spell Scribe or something from Amonkhet or Hour of Devastation. I forget what it's exactly called. I'm kind of kicking myself for not remembering that name. But 3 mana 1/4, not really a good body size. It's like, you'll sometimes play that. And then 2 mana sacrifice it to return instant or sorcery from your graveyard to your hand is like fine. I think this card, last time around, it was a 3 mana 2/2. 3 mana 1/4, this type of effect on the Spell Scribe. I know it's not called Spell Scribe, but it was something like that back in Amonkhet. Last time around, it was a 3 mana 2/2, which is obviously much worse of a body, and that card ended up being pretty much unplayable. But a 3 mana 1/4 is definitely a solid defensive option. So I think Spellkeeper Weird is a little bit better than the other card was. So I think this card's going to be a 2.5, maybe a 3 even, because I think this format is going to be slower. So buying back your removal spells is going to be more relevant. I think the 1/4 body is going to help you stall the game a lot longer to get to the late game, where buying back your removal is more relevant. And also, I think there's just going to be enough powerful removal options or instants and sorceries running around that you're going to want to be able to get them back. So I think this card's going to be a 2.5 or a 2 or a 3, somewhere in that range. I know that's a pretty wide range, but it does depend on how fast the format ends up being, because a 3 mana 1/4 that ends up sacrificing itself is generally not going to be a good enough card. But if the format ends up being very slow, I could see it being more playable. And also in sealed, it's going to be much more playable and powerful than much better in sealed than in draft, because that's generally a slower format as well. So I'm going to start off with this card being like final grade 2.0. But keep in mind, 2.0s do make it into your deck pretty decent amount of the time, and they're just not like the cards you're happy putting in your deck. So yeah, I think Spellkeeper Weird is going to be a decent card in the format, especially if the format ends up being slow. Stealth Mission is very tricky to evaluate. It is a sorcery speed, buff your creature, and also helps you take out planeswalkers, which I do think is good. Also, it helps you with Proliferate. Proliferate is going to be a very key mechanic to see how it plays out, because depending on how good it is, you may want to just put cards like this in your deck just so you can get counters onto your creature and start proliferating. That being said, I am going to start off with Stealth Mission being a 1.5. It borders between unplayable and unhappy to play with it, unless there's I could see it being a good sideboard card for if your opponent has some really good planeswalkers that you just need to kill, or I could see it being the type of card that leads to its own archetype, where you just stealth mission onto the same creature, proliferate onto that creature, and just kind of kill your opponent by making an unblockable threat. But I generally think stealth mission is not going to be a very good card, so I'm going to start off with it being a 1.5 in this format, unless you have a bunch of proliferate, in which case it does go up to maybe a 2.5 at its peak and especially if you need to kill some key planeswalkers. Next up, we have Tammys Epiphany. Now, I have this as the number 5 blue common, but I don't think this card's actually insane. I think it's like a 3.0 card, maybe a 2.5. I think the first copy might be a 3, and the second copy a 2.5, but those are just semantics. As I was saying, the numbers don't really matter. What this card does is it digs incredibly deep into your deck. Scry 2 is almost like draw a card, and Scry 4 is... The higher number of Scry you put on the card, it has diminishing returns. Like the first Scry 1 is much better than the next Scry 1 because if you find the card you want, the other Scries are wasted. But Scry 4 is a tremendous amount of Scry. So I think Tammys Epiphany is really going to help you find the powerful cards you need, especially in sealed. If you're trying to find a bomb rare or color fixing or a certain planeswalker or a removal spell, Tammys Epiphany is going to find that card for you. It digs 6 cards deep. That's like 6 out of 40 is... Oh my gosh, I'm so sad. 1/7 of your deck, about 6 out of 40, 6, 12, 18, 24, 30. Yeah, 1/7 of your deck. I did get it right. But Tammys Epiphany is going to be a card that if the format's too quick, it's not going to be a very good card. But I'm banking on the format being a little bit slower. You're going to be able to put up some walls and defend yourself, put up your shields, as they say. So I think Tammys Epiphany is going to end up being a solid card, maybe probably a 3.0 for the first copy. It does get worse in multiples because you can't just spend all of your turns casting 4 mana do nothing cards, but I mean do nothing to affect the board cards. But it is going to be a solid enough card, I think. Next up, we have Fairies Time Twist. I do like the alliteration on this card name. Again, this card is going to depend on how good Proliferate ends up being, because in this set there's not really a ton of enchantment removal other than Kazimierz transformation. They don't tend to put a ton of that into the set because they don't want you to be able to just do that onto an army token, and then the army token is kind of wasted. So Teferi's Time Twist is a lot going to depend on how good the Proliferate counter is, and also if you can save a creature with it. So I think that Teferi's Time Twist is going to be a solid card, but not like a card that you're happy running in your deck. So it's like a slight step below a 3.0. I think it's going to be a 2.5 or maybe a 2, especially the first copy. It does get way worse in multiples, but I think that a lot of the time you're going to be able to potentially save a creature from a removal spell, use it to use it to kind of give a creature pseudo vigilance in some cases, just things like that. I think Teferi's Time Twist is going to be like a decent enough card. It's not going to be great because like bringing the creature back on the next end step is not as good as just flickering it immediately, I think, because you can't really like surprise block things. But Teferi's Time Twist definitely, and it also can't exile opposing permanents, but I think it's going to be like a 2.0, a 2.5, something like that. The first copy maybe a 2.5, the second copy maybe a 2.0. The blue commons really aren't that great, so in the context of the other blue commons it's a lot better, but I think it's generally just a 2.0 card. Not a very powerful card, but a card you'll play sometimes and it'll be fine. Next up we have Thunder Drake, a card that I'm very excited to play because the term Thunder Drake sounds awesome, and the card art is awesome, and the effect is awesome. So I'm really excited for this card. I have it as the number 3 blue common, and I think it is going to be a key performer in the format. First of all, it gets counters all on its lonesome. It doesn't need any enablers to be able to be proliferated upon, and this is a flyer, so counters put onto flyers are even better than counters put onto ground creatures. Casting 2 spells in a turn, especially once you get past 4 mana, gets easier and easier. You can even save spells to enable that, and Thunder Drake being able to get counters on it, a 4 mana 2/3, not the greatest, but a 4 mana 3/4, actually a really good deal. And then a 4 mana 4/5, 5/6 gets even bigger and bigger as the game goes on. Granted, you often will run out of gas by that point, but if you're reloading with Tammys Epiphanies into like cheaper spells, things like that, or proliferating onto Thunder Drake, I think it's going to be a key player in the format, and I think you're going to lose a lot of games to Thunder Drake just getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and you slowly dying to the pressure. So I think Thunder Drake is going to be a great card in the format. Definitely one of the top 5 blue commons for sure, especially considering how weak the blue commons are. Totally Lost has made a return, and I think Totally Lost is actually going to get a chance to shine in this format because of how mediocre the other blue commons are. I think Totally Lost has generally been pretty mediocre to bad. It's generally been like a 2.0 card that you like put in your deck, but it's not like the greatest because 5 mana to put an online permanent on top of your opponent's deck is generally quite expensive. That being said, I think Totally Lost is going to be a fine card in this format. Probably just going to be another 2.0 card, but keep in mind, putting Planeswalkers on top of their deck is decent, and having access to removal spells is nice when you are trying to attack Planeswalkers. So Totally Lost, definitely a card to keep in mind. Maybe it ends up being a 2.5 or 3.0, but I think Totally Lost is going to be like a 2, and it's going to be a fine role player, but nothing insane. Finally, we have Wall of Runes. I'm not high on Wall of Runes. 1 mana for a 0/4 is I generally don't like creatures with 0 power in limited because they can't trade with anything. So the fact that they can't trade means that a lot of the time they're going to be just stalling the game. And maybe if you have enough good win cons at the top end, stalling the game's fine. Scry 1 attached to that is like pretty nice. This card reminds me a little bit of Barrier of Bones from Guilds of Ravnica. That was a 1 mana 0/3 that surveilled one, but surveil was actually a relevant keyword in the set, whereas Scry really isn't. So I think Wall of Runes is going to be pretty unplayable, probably just a 1. Not a card you're going to want to be putting in your deck, even if you are quite defensive. That being said, this type of effect sometimes surprises me. Wall of Mist was sometimes playable in the sets that it's been in, which is the 2-mana 0/5, and a 1-mana 0/4 is probably a little bit better than a 1-mana. A 2-mana 0/5 is a little bit worse than a 1-mana 0/4, I think. So Wall of Runes might see a little bit of play, but I generally am going to advise you to avoid it. That is going to do it for the commons. That brings us to the uncommons. First up, we have Auger of Bolus. This card is a card that is a reprint, so I'm sure a lot of you already know what it does, but there's a running joke in the community that Auger of Bolus reads, look at the top 3 cards of your library, put them on the bottom of your library in any order, because you do miss with this card a lot, especially in draft, where you don't have as much control over how many instants and sorceries you run in your deck. That being said, if this drew you a card half the time, it would probably still be a good card. I don't know the exact odds of number of instants and sorceries you need for that to be a half the time proposition, but I'm thinking, and there's not a ton of great instants and sorceries in blue, but I'm thinking that, like, if you have 7 or 8 instants and sorceries in your deck, you're going to hit a card about half the time maybe, and at that point the card becomes quite nice, because you will be drawing a card off of your 2-drop, which is really nice. It replaces itself, and it's a 1/3 body. So I think this card is going to be a 3.0, 3.5 if you have enough instants and sorceries in your deck. Definitely a good card to keep in mind. Bond of Insight is an interesting one. It's a delayed draw to, in a way, but only if you have enough instants and sorcery cards in your graveyard. And it also, like, mills your opponent randomly, so you can kind of enable some of their synergies potentially. But I think that this card is going to end up being, like, a very niche card. You're not going to necessarily want to run Bond of Insight in every deck, but in the decks that do want Bond of Insight, I think it's going to be a 3.5, because it does draw you 2 spells, it does get you some instants and sorceries to fuel your other instants and sorcery spell matters, potentially, and so I think Bond of Insight is going to be, in a lot of decks, it's going to be like a 2, like maybe you'll have, in a lot of decks it's going to be unplayable straight up, because you're not going to be able to return 2 instants and or sorcery cards to your hand, which, if you're not drawing 2 cards with this, it's very bad. But if you're only drawing 1 card, it's not great. If you're drawing 0 cards, you just lose the game on the spot for spending 4 mana to do nothing. But in the right deck, I could see Bond of Insight being much better. And in a slow sealed format, maybe with a couple Tammys Epiphanies in your deck, I could see Bond of Insight being a role player. So I think in the decks that want it, it's going to be a 3.5. You're kind of going to know when your deck wants it. And a lot of the other scenarios, it will be a 1.5. A 1 or a 1.5 type card. Next up, we have Eternal Skylord. 5 mana for a 3/3 is, like, not great, but it does amass 2 and gives your zombie tokens flying. Giving army tokens flying is a huge deal. I think this card is going to be a 3.5. It's like a 3/3 with a 2/2 attached at the worst case scenario, and in the better case scenario, you're already going to have like a 4/4 army or like a 3/3 army, and you make it into a 5/5 flyer right off the bat. So I think giving your army flying is going to be really huge. It's going to be hard to deal with those flying armies, and Eternal Skylord is going to be a key card to take. Definitely a 3.5, maybe even a 4.0. It's hard. I can't believe I haven't said 4.0 yet, but this card definitely has potential. Next up, we have Flux Chandler. This card's really going to depend on how many +1/+1 counter synergy cards you have, and how many instants and sorceries you have. And how many non-creature spells you have. I think that there's going to be a delicate balance with Flux Chandler, but I generally don't think it's going to be very good. I think this card's going to be a 2.0, 2.5 maybe. But if you have the right deck for it, I could see it going all the way up to a 2.5, because if you do have a decent number of cards with counters on them, or you have a couple planeswalkers, then proliferating onto those could be quite good. But I generally think this card's going to be mediocre, not great, not really a limited card, so probably a 2.0 or maybe a 2.5. Next up, we have Jace's Triumph. Draw 2 cards for 3 mana. It's divination. That card's always solid, so I'm going to give this just a solid 3.0. It's never going to be, like, insane. In some formats, it goes up to a 3.5, like it's a card you actively want. You're never really going to have a Jace Planeswalker. It's a mythic, or maybe it's just a rare, but it's a rare, I think. Yeah, it's a rare. But it does get a little bit better if you have a Jace Planeswalker, but not that much better, because the Jace Planeswalker is not very good. But Jace's Triumph, going to be a 3, sometimes a 3.5 if the format's a little bit slower. Next up, we have Casa Minha. I think Casa Minha is incredible. 4 mana, you immediately make a 2/2. Your opponent has trouble targeting your spells. This card is definitely a 4, maybe even a 4.5. 4 mana for a 2/2 that draws a card and discards a card is not great. But the fact that it does then makes another one. So you, for 4 mana, have made 2 2/2s that draw a card, discard a card. Is incredible. And then next, your opponent has a harder time removing your creatures, which is just really nice. It's just a static effect that sits there. And if you ever can make a third 2/2 creature, it's just really good. The fact that you loot when you make these wizards is really good. And I think Casa Minha is going to be a 4, maybe even a 4.5. I'm very high on Casa Minha, and I'm very excited to play with this card. Definitely a great option for the blue decks, and a really cool new Planeswalker. I'm very excited to play with it. Yeah, definitely an excellent card. I think yeah, you just make the 2/2 whenever you can, and it's going to be great, especially because there's a ton of proliferate, and there doesn't seem to be a ton of great things to proliferate onto in this set in general. Though maybe I'm under-evaluating how many planeswalkers you're going to be having. Next up, we have Lasso Templating. I think this card's going to function as a counterspell enough of the time that this card's actually going to work out to be a solid 3. Giving your permanents, you control hexproof is oftentimes just going to read counter target removal spell, and the fact that you get to amass 1 means that sometimes you could maybe use it as a combat trick for your army token. So Lasso Templating is going to get a 3 from me, but I could see situations where it does a ton of good work, and I could definitely see situations where it does pretty much nothing. So it's definitely a very swinging card in that regard. Next up, we have Narset, Parter of Veils, a 3-mana planeswalker with 5 loyalty. You're super excited, and then you realize that it is basically just a potentially draw a card and potentially just do nothing. In limited, you're not going to generally have a ton of non-creature spells in your deck. You're maybe going to have 7 of them, and so Narset looking at 4 cards means that you will draw one a decent amount of the time, but your opponent can potentially then just attack your Narset. It dies, so you just played 3 mana to just kind of look at your top 4 cards. That being said, Narset's going to be a 3.0, maybe even a 3.5 if the format ends up being slower, because you can oftentimes draw 2 cards with this, and then it sits into play and makes it so your opponent can't draw 2 cards in a turn if they're also playing a blue deck, so it's kind of annoying for them. It's also only 3 mana, so I think Narset's going to be a 3.5. Definitely, you're going to have to build around it a little bit, but it's going to be an effective card in your decks. It's just, I wish it was a little bit better, because Narset's one of my favorite planeswalkers, and I just like the card a lot, because that was the first planeswalker I ever opened. Key fact about NicolaiBolas here. Finally, we have Rescuer Sphinx. 4 mana for a 3/2 flyer, already a solid rate. I'm pretty happy with that already. And then you can also return a non-land permanent you control to its owner's hand to have it come with a counter, which is also just added upside. So a 4 mana 3/2 is already solid, and it comes with added benefit of potentially bouncing one of your creatures to re-trigger and enter the battlefield effect, or maybe in the late game it just doesn't do anything bad, or maybe you can even reset a planeswalker, which is huge. So I think Rescuer Sphinx is going to be a 3.5, especially if you have some planeswalkers in your deck. It's just going to do excellent work. So that is going to do it for the uncommons, and next up we will talk about the rares. Hello and welcome to the rares section. Sorry for that little bit of delay. Let's jump right into it. We're going to start off with Commence the Endgame. Now, in Limited, this card is not going to be as good as it potentially will be in Constructed, because by the time you get to 6 cards, you're generally not going to have all that many cards left in your hand. You might have 1 left, so you'll be amassing for 3, but still, uncounterable draw 2, amass 3 could be a decent card in Limited. It's just not going to be insane. In Constructed, you're generally probably not going to be running a ton of amass cards, so this is just going to make like a 6/6 creature for you. But if you're just putting some counters on a creature, draw 2 mana, do 2 cards for 6 mana is a lot, and it doesn't give you an extra blocker in many cases. So I think Commence the Endgame is going to be a solid card, don't get me wrong, but I don't think it's going to be anything more than that in Limited. So I think that it's going to probably be a 3.0. A solid 3. It's going to be a card that you're going to play, but it's not really going to be like, oh, I opened a Commence the Endgame type card. I think this card could be a little bit of a trap for some people, because in Constructed, it has been a little bit hyped up. I know Mike Sigrist wrote an article where he talked about how good this card will be in Constructed, and he made a lot of good points, but in Limited, this card is just going to be a solid card. Nothing too insane there. Next up, we have Fibblethp the Lost. I think that's how I'm going to pronounce it. Okay, I'm done trying to pronounce it. The Lost. Basically, this is an Elvish Visionary, which is always going to be a solid card. I'm going to give this a C grade. Just a 2 mana 1/1 that draws you a card when it enters the battlefield. It's just a solid enough card. Nothing too insane, but nothing too. It's definitely a card that you're happy to play. You're not really going to be getting all that much extra value from it shuffling in, and you're pretty much never casting it from your library unless you have other rares. But it's definitely going to be a card you are happy to play. You're not going to take it super early, but it's going to be a card that you are pretty fine with playing. So, I'm going to give that a solid 3. Next up, we have Finale of Revelation, which is going to be a 4, maybe even a 4.5. I'll do it. 4.5. Finale of Revelation is not going to win you the game single-handedly, but it's going to, if you get to the later stages of the game, it will bring you pretty darn close by drawing you a ton of cards. You can't use this to target your opponent, so there's no like mill them out shenanigans, and you're probably never going to get X to be 10 or more. But if you're using this to draw 4 cards, it's going to be a really good card. If you're going to be using this to draw 3 cards, it's going to be a really good card. 2 cards, it's still like fine. So this card is good at almost any stage of the game, and it's pretty easy to cast. Keeping that in mind, it is a sorcery, so it's not like going to completely break things, like it's not going to be completely broken, like you can't do it at instant speed, but it's going to be a very good card, and you're going to be taking this very early, playing this every time, and trying to draft a controlling game plan that can win the game based on Finale of Revelation. Solid 4.5 there. Definitely not the best of the best, though. God Eternal Kefnet, though, comes pretty close. I think this card could potentially be a 5. I think I'm going to stick with 4.5, though. Definitely a 4.5 card here. God Eternal Kefnet is one of those cards that can be bogged down in the fact that it has a lot of text on it, and that text doesn't always come up. It is a 4-mana 4/5 flyer, though, that can't really die, and that it shuffles back in your deck no matter what, pretty much. So just keeping that in mind, the card is pretty dang good. It's also a zombie, so there's some minor synergies with that. And the ability does come up from time to time. It's a really complicated ability. I'm not 100% sure like how it's going to work out in practice. Like, you can reveal instants and cast them easier, and it's going to be a good ability when it comes up for sure. So definitely going to give this a 4.5. It's just a very good card. It can be definitely a 5.0 though in your deck if you have enough instants and sorceries, for sure though. So keep that in mind. If you put like, say, 5 instants or sorceries, it's going to be a 5.0, maybe even just generally a 5.0. This card's definitely unreal, absurd bomb. Take it every time you see it, and be very happy playing it. The only reason I hesitate to give it a 5.0 is because like the Oketra god that we saw from white was like even more absurd. But generally, God Eternal Cabinet is going to be a straight up house in limited. So yeah, what the heck, we'll give it a 5.0. Really good card. Next up, we have Jace, Wielder of Mysteries. Now this card is a card you need to be a little bit wary of because it's really hard to cast. Triple blue in limited is no easy feat, and the card does nothing to protect itself. Now there are a lot of planeswalkers in this set that do not protect themselves. And Jace actually has a plus ability, unlike a lot of the planeswalkers, so he is going to put you ahead on cards if he sticks around for a while. But keep in mind, if you're playing Jace, you're not playing a creature to protect him. A lot of the time, he's going to be pretty mediocre. If you play him, and then plus him again, and then he dies, you've drawn 2 cards, which is like a 4-mana divination. It's generally not going to be an insane card in limited. I think it will still be passable if you build your deck around being a little bit defensive, and then you maybe use Jace as a win con. You can target the opponent, so you can just mill them out. I think targeting yourself is going to be a little bit less reliable because then if Jace dies, you're just going to mill out yourself. So that is a bit of a risk. So I think you're probably going to be milling the opponent a lot of the time. But I think Jace is probably not going to be the greatest card in limited. I think it's going to probably be like, I hate to say it, but I think Jace is probably a 2 in limited. He's just so hard to protect, and I can definitely see a lot of world. I think he's probably worse than Casa Minha. Let's just put it that way. Casa Minha was great. Jace is more like, if he sticks around, he's good, but he's probably not going to stick around all that much. So he's probably just a 2. Narset's Reversal is a really odd card. It's kind of like a counterspell, but it's like a remand mixed with a fork effect. So you copy the spell, but then you also return to the owner's hand, and it has to be an instant or sorcery. So it's a very narrow counterspell, and then you choose new targets for the copy. So it's like a 2-mana removal spell, but it's only a very situational removal spell because it has to copy the opponent's removal spell, and then they still get access to the removal spell, so it doesn't straight up counter the removal spell. So in that way, it's like worse than redirecting the removal spell because the opponent still gets it. I think you could, the fact that you can copy your own spells with this might make it a little bit better, but I'm still just gonna stick it in the like kind of a janky rare pile for now. It could be perform a little bit better, so I'm gonna say that it's probably gonna be a 2 card, like a 2 out of 5 card here. It's probably gonna be a 2, but in the right deck, if you have say 4 pieces of cheap removal and you've seen a couple from your opponent, the card could be really good. So it's really hard to rate. I'm gonna start with a 2, maybe it's a 3. I just don't think you should be taking this card very early because it's very situational, very hard to use it, and if your opponent sees you use it, they're probably not going to cast their removal into 2 open mana, and if your opponent doesn't have any removal, it could be hard to just tack extra 2 mana onto your removal spell. Maybe you won't have good targets, so I'm going to start out with this card being like a 2.2, 2.5 type card. Next up, we have Silent Submersible. I love this card. I think the flavor is cool. Like, there's a submarine in Magic the Gathering, but I'm not sure how good the card is going to end up being. Double blue is kind of hard to cast on turn 2 sometimes, and then it's only a 2/3, so it's relatively easy to block. The crew cost is a little bit difficult at 2. I mean, most creatures are going to be able to crew it, but some creatures won't be able to crew it, like the 1/4s, the 1/2 flyers, the 1/3s of the world won't be able to crew it by themselves. And if it deals combat damage, sure, you draw a card, but it's not that big of a vehicle. It's not going to have that huge of an impact. I still think the card is going to be pretty good. I think it's going to be a solid 3. You're going to play this in almost every deck. Vehicles are just generally pretty good. It's essentially going to give a lot of your creatures haste. Your opponent might have to leave back extra blockers because they don't want to get hit with this. But generally, I'm thinking it's going to be just a 3, just a solid card, but nothing too special. Next up, and finally, we have Spark Double, and this card is insane. You can copy any creature, but it has to be one you control, and you can copy Planeswalkers, which is even sweeter. So in limited, it might not be the most insane, but I guess I got carried away with how cool it is and constructed and stuff. But keep in mind, it has to be a planeswalker or creature you control. I kind of forgot about that for a second. It has to be a creature you control, so you kind of have to have some good stuff going on. But it's going to lead to some sweet stuff, and you might have a good planeswalker, and then it comes in with extra loyalty, and you have some super friends action. So Spark Double probably just going to be a 3.0. A lot of the time, these cards can copy your opponent's big spells, but still, and it does cost 4 mana, so you kind of want to be copying something bigger. But I can definitely see some good scenarios. It also gives you a nice thing for proliferate, so definitely going to be. I'm gonna say Spark Double's a 3.5. Let's just go there, because putting the counter on it means it's relevant for proliferate, and copying planeswalkers is sweet. So we're going to say Spark Double's a 3.5. That is going to do it for all of the blue cards. Let me know what you thought by leaving a comment in this comment section down below. What do you think the best card in blue is? I think it's Kefnet personally, but I'd love to hear what you think. And remember to hit that thumbs up button to support future set reviews on this channel. Hit that thumbs up, subscribe to stay with us and join the team. And I will talk to you in my future videos. I'll see you guys later. If you made it all the way to the end, say hashtag war blue. So yeah, let me know you made it. See you later.